So good morning, all. I'm here today to present to you on the N-word, the history of it, as well as our modern context. And we're here today for a few reasons. The first is to respond to a communal trauma. Mr. Mack shared the details with us yesterday that the word was written on a whiteboard in the Athletic Center. And I think most of us know intuitively that word has a history, has a context, has a pain associated with it. When then that kind of thing happens, it can be traumatic. The second reason that we're here is to create a common understanding of that word. I bet if I asked each of you individually about the word, you'd be able to tell me that it is problematic, that it is painful, that it shouldn't be said, and yet you might not know the details, the history. So I want us to have a common understanding walking away from this. And finally, we've committed to do this kind of work. It's in our DEI statement, it's in our motto, it's in our mission, it's in our portrait of the graduate. It's a fundamental part of who we are as a community, that when we face a challenge, we lean into it in order to ensure that everyone feels welcomed and wanted and at home here. Now, this is a difficult topic. We don't take up the conversation lightly. I understand most of you are probably uncomfortable. I'm certainly a little bit uncomfortable right now. And yet I thank you for leaning in for the next 20 minutes or so. I will not use the word today. I will say the N-word as a substitute. When I've got it on screen, it will be the letter N with 5 or 6 asterisks. And if you find this particularly challenging, if you're in a moment when you need to step out, I welcome you to do so. So we'll start with the thought that Mr. Mack shared with us yesterday, that this is a complex word, and making sense of it is particularly challenging. Why is that the case? On the one hand, it elicits strong emotional reactions from many. This is my dad. He's there with his dogs, Donnie and Wesley. He's a pretty laid-back guy. He's a law school professor, taught contract law for a number of years. He doesn't get rattled too much. A number of years ago, my brother, and I were in a car heading to my sister's softball game. I guess the guy in front of us thought we got too close. He pulled around the side of us and flipped my dad off. So my dad flipped him off back. I'm looking at this guy, and he mouthed something, and I could swear he mouthed F-U, you N-word. Before I knew what happened, my dad guns it, revs the engine, drives in front of this guy, cuts him off, puts it in park, gets out of the car, and goes running at him. I'm like, oh my God, what is happening? This guy floors the car at my dad. My dad keeps running. The guy stops, throws it in reverse, and drives away. As a follow-up again to the kind of guy that my dad is, as the guy was driving off, I yelled at the car, F you. My dad gets in the car and says, Andrew, watch your language. But this relatively laid-back guy, this professor, at a minimum, a very logical guy, was so blinded with rage at the thought of somebody calling him this word that he got out of a car and ran at a 2,000-pound vehicle. Right? So on the one hand, you've got that. And I'll speak for myself. I think that was a moment when I first understood the weight of this word. On the other hand, it is everywhere, right? It's in our music. It's in movies. It's a salutation. Right? So how do we make sense of these disparate realities? How can a word incite such strong emotions and yet be so common? And that's what I hope to explore a bit today. So I'm going to provide a brief history of the word, and for the sake of transparency, I'm going to credit Professor Randall Kennedy. He's a law school professor at Harvard. Much of the history I'm going to share with you today, I've gleaned from his book. The book is entitled N-Word, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word, so I do want to give credit where credit is due. The word has its origins as a descriptive term. The root is the Latin for the color black, niger. And though it started as a descriptive term, it became known as having a negative, a derogatory connotation in the 1800s. Now, these are quotes from folks who were living in the 1800s, and they understood the word in this way, that it was meant to impose contempt upon black Americans as an inferior race, and it was meant to injure. It was meant to be injurious. And that is the way that the word was understood. And historically, white children were indoctrinated at an early age with this understanding. If they were being bad, they were told that they were being worse than N-words, or ignorant as N-words. And when we talk about that indoctrination, it was even in children's rhymes. I'm sure many of us are familiar with eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Well, that at its origin was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an N-word by the toe. And it was used in any number of different contexts. Reacting to the news that Booker T. Washington had dined at the White House, Senator Ben Tillman of South Carolina predicted the action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that N-word will necessitate our killing 1,000 N-words before they will learn their place. Malcolm X was having a conversation with his teacher about wanting to go into the law. His teacher implored him to pursue carpentry and saying, be realistic about being an N-word. Jackie Robinson, while playing in Philadelphia against the then Philadelphia Athletics, had a number of things yelled at him, including, hey, N-word, why don't you go back to the cotton fields where you belong? For those of you who haven't studied U.S. history during the 60s, there were a number of different protests. Some of them, one set of protests, were the Freedom Rides. A mixed group of black and white Americans got on buses, rode around in the segregated South to different bus terminals. The driver of the Freedom Riders, cheerfully anticipating the beatings to come when they pulled into Anniston, Alabama, was quoted as saying, well, boys, I brought you some N-words and some N-word lovers. N-word lover being a term often applied to white Americans who were sympathetic to and supportive of black Americans. Bad luck was N-word luck. Bad news was N-word news. Heavy boots were called N-word stompers. And that's a picture of the bus, the Freedom Riders Road, now it's Anniston, Alabama, burning out. So there are a number of different contexts here, different details. The commonality, and what we cannot get away from, is the N-word as demeaning, as oppressive, and as portending violence. Black Americans were brutally tortured and murdered, and this was likely the word that was screamed at and about them as it was happening. I have a picture in the bottom right-hand corner of a lynching, and I picked one of the smaller ones I could find because I didn't want it to be too shocking, and yet I think it's important that we see it, because inscribed in pencil is Bo pointing to his N-word. And if you look at the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a lock of hair that was taken from the man who was lynched and pressed in the frame. That was something that was common with lynchings, to take body parts from the person who had been lynched, be it knuckles or bones or hair. I think it's also a history worth noting that if you look at that picture, you can see in the foreground a crowd. Lynchings were public. People often traveled 4 miles to be there. And if there's something that is of interest to you, there's a great photo documentary, Without Sanctuary, and I would recommend looking that up. So here's the historical bottom line, and I realize this was a brief history, but the history of this word is fixed and indisputable. It has not changed from the time that this word became derogatory, and it will not change for as long as the word exists. We're going to talk about the modern context, but at no point today or in the future should you forget the roots of this word. It is rooted in violence, in hatred, in oppression, in disenfranchisement, in intimidation, in beatings, in castration, in shootings, in murder. Now, given that, the word is used in different contexts. For as long as the word has existed, it has likely been used by black Americans in an ironic or subversive form. Black Americans would had a joke about folks going to register to vote. After a black man answered a battery of questions, black folks used to have to take literacy tests in order to vote. a man was handed a newspaper in a foreign language and asked for a translation. The man said, "Yeah, I know what it means. It means that N-words don't vote in Mississippi." The Reverend Dr. King, who we'll be spending a lot of time celebrating in the next week, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, in talking about Jim Crow etiquette, said, "Your first name becomes N-word, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John." And Muhammad Ali, in refusing to fight in the Vietnam War, was quoted as saying, "No Viet Cong ever called me N-word." These are instances of the word being used to point out how terrible it is and how terrible this treatment is. And there's a picture of the Reverend Dr. King in jail and a picture of a newspaper talking about Muhammad Ali. His given name was Cassius Clay, and being sentenced to 5 years in jail as well as a $10,000 fine. The word is also common in popular culture, and that's been formalized by a number of different cultural icons. We see it in comedy. Richard Pryor, who is a famous comedian, was probably the first comedian to normalize the use of the word in comedy routines. His third album was entitled "That N-Word's Crazy." And there have been a number of comedians that have followed since. Chris Rock, one of his specials is N-words versus black people. We see it in rap, and I assume that many of us are familiar with this. One of the first groups to, again, popularize and formalize this was the group NWA, which of course is short for N-words with attitude. One of their songs, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but if you invert it, it's N-words for life. And Tupac is quoted as having said that the N-word stood for never ignorant, gets goals accomplished. And there's a picture of Richard Pryor and NWA. And we even see contexts in which the N-word is thought of as positive. Author Claude Brown calls the word the most soulful word he knows. Journalist Jarvis DeBerry claimed that the word is beautiful in its multiplicity, the multiple different emotions that it can express. The author of the book I'm pulling from frequently says that the N-word can be a compliment. When talking about somebody playing on the athletic field, you played like a real N-word today, meaning a compliment. And of course, we know it in its form as a salutation. And I'm not going to read this quote to you, but I think this captures something, so I'll let you read this. So how do we reconcile these competing understandings? How is the N-word with its painful history so commonplace? Author Ta-Nehisi Coates has an answer for us, so I'm going to play two parts of a video to you and help to break that down.
Words don't have meaning without context, okay? My wife refers to me as honey. That's accepted and okay between us. If we were walking down the street together and a strange woman referred to me as honey, that wouldn't be acceptable. The understanding is I have some sort of relationship with my wife. Hopefully I have no relationship with this strange woman. When I was young and I used to go see my family in Philadelphia where my dad was from, they will all call him Billy. His name is William Paul Coates. No one in Baltimore called him Billy, and had I referred to my father as Billy, that probably would have been a problem. That's because the relationship between myself and my dad is not the same as the relationship between my dad and his mother and his sisters who he grew up with, right? We understand that. It's the same thing with words within the African American community or within any community. My wife, with her girlfriend, will use the word bitch. I do not join in. I don't, say, hey, I don't do that. I don't do that. And perhaps more importantly, I don't have a desire to do it. You understand?
So his first point is that context and relationships make words what they are. The words do not have meaning without context and relationships, right? Our context and our relationship to a word dictates the meaning of that word.
It's normal, actually, for groups to use words that are derogatory in an ironic fashion. Why is there so much hand-wringing when black people do it? Black people are basically, however you feel about it, they're not outside of the normal rules and laws for humanity. I had a good friend who used to have this cabin in upstate New York, which he referred to as the white trash cabin. He was white. I would never refer to that cabin. I would never tell him I'm coming to your white trash cabin. I just wouldn't do that. You know what I mean? I think you understand why I wouldn't do it.
And his second point is that in-group use of derogatory terms is normalized. That relationship to a word, that context in which a word is used, makes it okay. That's his argument. So, in some ways, we've ended back where, or we are back where we've started. The history of the word is uniquely terrible, and there's a context in which it's akin to other derogatory words, where that use is normalized. And this dissonance leads to a number of different understandings of the word, and understandably so. That dissonance between the history of the word and our norms around who can and cannot use a word based on context and relationships. And I'm just going to play two different clips of folks responding to the word.
How does hearing the N-word make you feel?
60 years ago when my grandfather was like young, that was fighting words coming from a friend, coming from a foe, coming from a stranger, coming from a relative, And now we're at the point where, it's almost like nigga is nothing.
See, it's hard to answer these kind of questions because the word doesn't have that much weight. Like it doesn't. It's hard to explain.
We disagree there
it's
on the
hard
weight
to explain.
piece, brother.
No, it has weight. It definitely has weight. I didn't mean to say it like that. I'm just saying when you're a casual user of the word, it loses some of its impact.
I was raised that that word was used to get somebody's attention if you were mad at them. No matter what the world thinks about my father, I was trained never to use that word or call a colored person a Negro unless I was just to the point that I really wanted to hurt them or want them to hurt me or just totally insult them to the lowest degree.
I know a lot of black people, including myself, I don't like to be called boy. Especially for somebody from the other race. But what's ironic about that is, with black people often, or any race really, oh, that's my boy. Chuck, that's my boy. D-Love, that's my boy. But I guess, like I said, we're saying it more of a term of endearment as opposed to like, hey boy, you better go do this. Because then that takes you back to that place that we didn't necessarily come from, but our family came from, and that's what is kind of like in our bloodstream, and we know. So it's like we know the hurt from what they had to go through, because we still struggling to this day from what happened during the slavery days, just as far as even economy and just growing up in some of the areas that we grew up in, and having family in prison and in and out of jail, stuff like that.
So I'm going to play, now you can hear there are a number of different responses. I want to play one more clip because I think it might speak to the experience of some of our community members who are not from the United States, for whom this word and the context is completely unfamiliar.
As I'm going to high school in '98, and then I'm hearing the term for the first time, I first didn't even know what it meant because I heard it so much that to me, it was a greeting. It was just a term that you use to communicate with each other. It's after a while that I realized, oh, actually this word has a negative connotation to it, which was not explained to me anyway. Like I'm coming from a French-speaking country, ending up in an English-speaking country, hearing those terms, not just that word, but there are even other words that you hear that say, oh. But within that environment, that did not affect really my perception of the person saying it?
For me, it was earlier than that. When I was a kid in Sierra Leone, we had an American mining company that my father worked for, and through this came, American popular culture, and it was during the days of the MTV rap and things like that, and so I got introduced to hip hop, and so I heard it through hip hop. But in those days, because of the way it was used, I came to associate it as more my brother, because it would be say my nigga, my this, and so that's what I thought. And the first time that I really began to feel the negativity of it, for me particularly, was in South Africa. When I'd left Sierra Leone and I was running from the war, I had ended up in South Africa. And in South Africa, they use the word kafir, and also they will use nigger as well, It was in South Africa that I began to see that being black the way I was offensive to some people, or that some people found something wrong with it. And so I lived in a neighborhood where each time I would come, if my host wasn't around and I tried to open the door, the police would come because they felt I was there doing something, which I don't know, whatever being black meant to them. And so whenever they would come, I would hear the police saying, hey, yes, this, that, and that, And then as soon as I spoke, they lowered their weapons and thought, oh, well, you're not from here. So it's the first time I realized that, okay, so I'm another person's nigger.
So, given this complexity, given the numerous different ways that people can understand this word, how do we proceed? I'm going to suggest some guidelines for us moving forward. First, white students, there is no context in which you should use this word. You are not part of the in-group, you're not part of the target group, and that's one of the criteria that Mr. Coates laid out. And the historical context is too overwhelming. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying that white people are responsible for the way that this word has been used in the past or is used currently. And yet, that historical context is still there and cannot be overcome. To black American students, I would recommend against using the word. I think the history is too serious. The word and the context is rooted, again, in violence and oppression. I choose not to. My friends know not to call me that word. If I meet somebody new who tries to, I make it very clear that I do not approve. However, Mr. Coates laid out an argument that there is a cultural context. There are cultural norms that would say the use of that word is okay. That's a choice you have to make. If that is a choice you do make, you need to remember that time and place matter. You cannot use that word in public settings on this campus. It is too injurious. There are too many different ways that folks can understand it. And if an adult community member, be they white, black, or otherwise, comes up to you and tells you not to use that word, you must listen to them. If you decide to use that word with friends who have made that same decision, again, I wouldn't recommend it, but I understand the argument for it. For non-black American students of color, it's complicated. There are some communities in which it is contextually appropriate to use that word. If that's a community that you come from and you decide to use that word again, I understand the argument for it, and I would just remind you that time and place matter. So a few parting thoughts. First, this was a lot, and I understand that you are probably feeling a lot. Let's continue this conversation, and let's do it in person. One of the things that I have learned, or I'm continuing to learn, is that conversations like these are difficult, and they're difficult in person. When they go online, when they become anonymous, they become even more difficult, and they often tear at the fabric of a community. If you have thoughts, if you have feelings, if you have objections, if you have questions, please seek out another member of this community, be an adult or otherwise. Please feel free to come into my office and tell me you disagree, or you don't understand, or you want to know more, or you want to talk. I am open to any of those lines of thought. Please don't take the end of our time here in this room as the end of this work, the end of this conversation. No matter who you are, this is a word that you are going to have to interact with and decide how you will interact with it for the rest of your life. What are you going to do when you hear somebody say it? Somebody who maybe can say it, maybe somebody who can't or shouldn't. What are you going to do when you hear this word in a song, at a dance? What are you going to do when you hear this word in a movie that you're watching and you have to discuss it with somebody else? These are questions that you need to answer for yourself, and it's going to take more work. I thank you for your time. I thank you for attention. I thank you for leaning in. I will be in the faculty room. It's not going to be a Q&A, but just an opportunity to chat if anybody wants to. Thank you very much.